Welcome back. This really is the faithful remnant, isn't it? Here we are. Yeah. All right. You have survived 2 lunch breaks now at this conference, and we'll see if we can keep you awake with this guy. Just want to say thanks again to our hosts, Derek and major sponsor Marcel, just to be here with you all. It's been a huge blessing to me and to my friend Peter. So, I mean, this is something, as Derek said earlier, we've been kind of talking about, anticipating for several years. And so it's been really great to kind of be with you all, to kind of see how the Lord has brought this together. But I know I haven't talked with every one of you in the room, but everyone I have talked to and with this last couple days has just been an absolute joy to me and an encouragement to me. So anyhow, I just want to know that you've already impacted me, and hopefully this conference has been used by our Lord to impact you in your hearts and minds, if for no other reason than just that the Word is solid, right? It's stable. It's like a rock, as Jesus says. And I hope that we walk out of here today with sheer confidence that we can preach, teach, share the Word of God. I don't know how many I've talked to in the last couple of days doing personal evangelism with Muslims and several people. And I just thought, what great ministry, what gospel ministry is happening here. And may we all kind of walk out of here with Martin Luther's perspective, right? When he looks back on the Reformation and how it started, right? What's he say? The Word did it all. Yeah, and so that's what we're all about here. Another comment I wanted to make just by way of introduction to this talk, and this actually goes for Peter's talk in the last segment, and that is, this is material that's not fully developed in the book, Scribes and Scripture. The stuff on apocryphal gospels, the stuff on ancient alphabetic scribal culture, this is material that we maybe took a page or 2 out of and just kind of developed it further. So I hope it's beneficial to you to maybe go in more depth than what the book does on these particular topics. Okay, so I am truly going in reverse, though. I started yesterday with the Old Testament canon, right? That's kind of like the last part of the process, but we went first, okay? And then we talked about the Old Testament text, right? The textual history of the Old Testament. How did the words of the Hebrew text come down to us? And now we're gonna I hate to say this, but it's gonna get a little more speculative, okay? But I want to be upfront with you about this, because I may come across a little confident in this lecture, but I have no business being so confident, okay? Because we're going to go back way before our earliest manuscripts with just about everything I put up on the screen here and talk about in the next 50 minutes or so. What's going to happen is we're going to back up and try to piece together the very fragmentary evidence of what ancient Israelite scribes had to work with, okay? And I hope that this will be helpful, but you could think of this in some sense as a little bit of the prehistory. We're going to look at scribes and what scribes did, but we're not going to be looking at Bible manuscripts, okay? And that's the slight disconnect, okay, in this particular talk. But what I'm hoping is that it fills out more of the circumstantial or the indirect case for how God was providentially working in Israel by providing an alphabet to work with, to write with, and not just an alphabet, but even a scribal curriculum, a scribal culture, by which scribes in Israel would be trained to write and to copy. Okay, does that make sense? Hopefully it will as we get into it. But that's what we're going to do. I'm going to address a few questions. Why write? Why write anything down in the first place? Talk a little bit about the history and the writing of the alphabet. And then early scribal education beyond the ABCs. That is, once you learn the ABCs, what would you do with that? We're going to describe the scribes' tools. What did they write with? How did they write? And then I want to paint a portrait of the scribe and the profession. and then finally draw some conclusions for our particular context here. So, why write in the first place? And have you thought, and we should have, by the way, but have you thought about writing as a technology, as something that had to be invented, something that had to be developed, right? It's funny, though, how the lexicon, right, the dictionary on these terms hasn't developed very far, because have you thought about your scrolling on your phone, right? Okay, but the scroll, right, goes back to like ancient Egyptian days, yeah? So, or I think about, Apple thinks it's really, really cute using a stylus, right? Okay, the little fancy pen, right? Well, the stylus, of course, is a reed, right? That was a term used from as long as writing's been around. So in some ways, though, someone had to invent this. Someone had to start this. And no one really knows how it got started. But I just wanted to make that point, that writing is, we need to think of it in terms of information technology. Even in ancient categories, ancient times, we had to think about writing as ancient technology. So why would you write something down? Well, in cultures where many stories were recited and transmitted orally among scribes, and not many people could read and write, what would the use of writing be? Well, reading and writing seem natural to us today, but again, these arts had to be invented. They had to be passed down and adapted for new circumstances. Many biblical books were written and transmitted during the period when writing or scribal culture was being passed from eastern Mesopotamian kingdoms to western Semitic peoples, who in turn made major developments and adaptations to that curriculum that they received. And although we cannot know definitively why people began to write down speech, writing appears to have been invented alongside the human desire to communicate accurately. Kings and diplomats would communicate with each other by sending messengers, right, with their messages. Right? This is in some ways so basic, right? It's so fundamental, right? But you have to kind of think about this. Who starts this? The ancient Sumerian epic, En-Makar and the Lord of Arata, this is usually dated to somewhere between 2000 and 1700 BC, imagines King En-Makar as the inventor of writing on clay tablets in the messenger context. And that's what is up behind me. It says his, or En-Makar's speech was very grand, its meaning very deep. The messenger's mouth was too heavy. He could not repeat it. Because the messenger's mouth was too heavy and he could not repeat it, the Lord of Kulab, or En-Makar, patted some clay and put the words on it as on a tablet. Before that day, there had been no putting words on clay. But now, when the sun rose on that day, so it was. The Lord of Kulab had put words on a tablet, so it was. Right? Now, did it happen this way? No, of course not. But it's such a plausible circumstance, right? You start to write things down when you can no longer remember, right? And that's what happens. En-Makar's message, of course, was too difficult for the messenger to remember and recite to the Lord of Arata, and thus the king wrote the message on a tablet and sent it with the messenger so that he would convey the message accurately. The desire and need, right, for accurate human communication inspired the invention of writing, and human beings have diligently innovated and advanced writing and reading technology ever since. Some of you have had the privilege of talking about that hexapla, Origen's hexapla with, over lunches and breaks, and I've also mentioned it in my talk yesterday, but just thinking about how even early Christians were always on the cusp of inventing and expanding information technology. Before Origen created that 6-columned Bible, or the hexapla, very little in antiquity, if anything really, had been ever put in parallel columns like that. Okay? Very little of the world's literature put that way. And he develops this technology in ways that had never even been imagined before. And so I always like to think of this Christian around 200 AD expanding and pushing the bounds of what the book can do. You see what I mean? And by doing that, he provided a major tool for Bible study, you see, for early Christians in Caesarea. So anyhow, I just am thinking about just the way in which communication and information technology has been developed. But it had to start with someone, first of all, taking an oral message and putting it down on a surface, didn't it? And that's what the Sumerian text here wants us to start thinking through. So, with that then, what do we know of the history and writing of the alphabet? All learning begins with the alphabet, right? Or the ABCs. Since the end of the 4th millennium BC, Mesopotamians and Egyptians used written signs for the description of spoken language. The Mesopotamians wrote in cuneiform, or wedges, while the Egyptians would use pictorial hieroglyphs, or sacred symbols. So here's a model of a sheep's liver, and I don't know if you can see it, but there's all of these different wedges, or cuneiform here, describing for the user of this text how to interpret the sheep's liver as it would be cut out of the sheep and land, right, in a certain position, right? These prophets of Mesopotamia had to interpret the entrails or the livers of animals. And of course, they would make some decision about whether to go to war or not, depending on how the liver fell. And so anyways, this text, as it's written on a liver, is actually describing to the student how to interpret the sheep's liver. Or we have we could have used numerous examples here, but some Egyptian writing here. Again, hero meaning sacred, glyph, symbol. And now we've got sacred, symbolic writing, okay? So these systems, of course, represented language at the word or syllable level, while the alphabet attempts to capture language at the level of the sound of a letter. And of course, we're concerned with the development of the latter of these three systems. So, what is the earliest traceable history of the alphabet? If someone asked me a question like that, I would have said, wasn't it the Phoenicians? It was the Phoenicians that invented the alphabet, and we simply get the history of writing from Phoenicia from somewhere around the 9th or 10th century BC. But the fact is, a lot of research and work has been done on this topic since that main thoroughgoing thesis, and we're actually going to be talking about the Phoenicians very little as a result. Because now, I think it's fair to say, the earliest agreed upon evidence for an alphabetic writing system comes from two Egyptian locations. The first is Serabit el-Kadem, which is a mining settlement in the Sinai Desert. This is usually dated to around 1700 BC. William F. Albright made a big deal of this. No one knows how to read those inscriptions, but they are clearly alphabetic in some way. But now, even that evidence has been surpassed by what was found at another Egyptian location known as Wadi el-Hol, which is a valley along an Egyptian trade route in the desert of Middle Egypt, where two alphabetic graffiti have been discovered, and the site is usually dated to around 1800 BC. So, out of this massive face that these archaeologists are looking at, the inscriptions are right here, you see. That's where the writing appears. Here's a better image, I think. So this is that second slope here, and this is the writing. I don't know if you can see it, and then someone made some artwork out of it here as well. So how does the system work in an inscription like this? Again, you have nothing to compare it to, right? This is 1800 BC. No one could figure this out immediately, but it's pretty clear that the letters were pictographic, and they functioned according to the so-called acrophonic principle. The pictograph resembles a word whose first letter represents the phoneme or the sound of the grapheme. So, for example, one of the symbols looks like flowing water, or the Semitic mayim. Okay? Let me get my laser pointer out here. And so you can actually see this here in the stone. Here it is in the artwork. And I've put the two side by side. And again, because the first sound of the word for water, mayim, is M, a pictographic depiction of water was intended to signify the M sound. Similarly, the word for snake in Semitic is nachash, and thus the pictographic depiction of the snake stood for the N sound. So again, here is the symbol for the snake, But again, this is representing the phoneme or the sound, N, because it was tied to this device, this acrophonic principle, and so nachash. You got the sound of the first letter of the word nachash. The symbol is supposed to help you remember the sound of the first letter of the word. Okay, so this is the earliest evidence, and that's pretty astonishing that we have alphabetic evidence in Egypt. You see, not Phoenicia, from this very early time. Okay, but again, not much to hang our hats on, right? There's not a lot of evidence surrounding this. The next major breakthrough on alphabets and abecediaries actually came in 2015 when archaeologists working in the Egyptian city of Thebes discovered a pottery shard known as an ostracon, okay, containing an Egyptian hieroglyphic Semitic practice alphabet known as an abecediary, or a scribal exercise to learn the letters of the alphabet and their order. The order of the first 5 letters is clear here, and they use a different order of the alphabet. We're used to, if you know Semitic alphabets, you're thinking of Aleph, Beth, Gimel, and Daleth. Well, there was an earlier order called the Halakam order, an H, L, C, H, and M order, okay? An earlier order to what's called the Abgad now, but Halakam is on this particular ostracon. And again, we see this acrophonic principle at work here as well. But not just that, it's kind of interesting because what you have here, just so we're clear, these are the letters of the alphabet, okay, coming down. And then these are Egyptian words or mnemonic devices meant to help the one learning the alphabet, you see. So they could work from the familiar Egyptian to the less familiar symbol, okay, of the alphabet. So this is a little tiny piece of clay, right? But already it's illustrating learning, isn't it? And I think that's interesting. And so what we have here then is a mnemonic device where we've got Hahana, okay, for the first letter of the alphabet. Hahana meant to make pleasant. And again, it's a playful device for the scribe to associate the sound H with the first alphabetic symbol, which here is pictured as a rejoicing man. The second word, Lawi, the one who bends, here is the mnemonic device used to associate the sound L with the second symbol in the abecediary, the one who bends like a wreath or perhaps a coiled rope. The third word, Chalpat, is a reed, this guy here, and is a mnemonic device, again, used to associate the sound Cha with the third symbol in the abecediary, a reed or a common plant that grew along the Nile River. The fourth word, Mayan, water, is the mnemonic device used to associate the sound M with the fourth symbol in the abecediary. The picture, again, is of running water, like we saw earlier, though note it's horizontal rather than it was vertical before. This TT99 ostracon and its abecediary, combined with the Egyptian artifacts of early alphabetic, like Wadi el-Hol, probably show that this alphabet was invented in Egypt and then made its way north up the Mediterranean coastline and shows early evidence of the Halakam order of the alphabet in Egypt. Moreover, in the context of an abecediary, we can see early learning of this alphabet. That is, a student here is attempting to learn his ABCs. And we'll come back to this point in a moment. So, at this point, though, all I want to say is that from this singular early alphabet, all alphabetic writing comes, okay? It's from this that the Phoenicians learned the alphabet, the Arameans, Hebrew, Greek, Latin. It's this alphabet that then sort of disseminates into all the other alphabetic languages that you can think of. As we've seen, the early alphabetic signs were originally pictographs, drawn using lines. And thus, this alphabet is called linear, right, to distinguish it from hieroglyphs and wedges in cuneiform. The early ABCDary shows how a student might learn the alphabet with mnemonic devices. The linear alphabet should be contrasted with the fixed wedges of alphabetic cuneiform, like at Ugarit. So there are ABCDaries from a place known as Ugarit in the land of Israel. This one here dated to about 1300 BC. But this system represented even a few vowels, which, again, all Semitic writing typically just represents consonants, not so much the vowels. But here, we actually have some vowels represented and a few more consonants in this particular ABCDary to accommodate sounds in the Eastern Semitic language of Akkadian. Scholars debate whether Egyptians or Semitic peoples who were familiar with the Egyptian writing system invented the alphabet. But in any case, by the end of the Late Bronze Age, or 1200 BC, and into the Early Iron Age, 1200 to 980 BC, the early alphabet, with its pictographs, had evolved into a simpler alphabet with simplified linear forms. The result is called Early Canaanite, or sometimes called Phoenician. Perhaps earlier, or around this time, another order of the alphabet was devised known as the Abgad order. It was created as a local Levantine order for the alphabet to distinguish it from its Egyptian counterpart. Thus, the Abgad order becomes a specifically Canaanite alphabet in distinction from the Halakam of Egypt. But this exciting field actually keeps turning up new finds, and that's what makes it both exciting and frustrating to try to stay on top of, okay? Even as I was writing up a section like this for the book Scribes and Scripture, I came across an article written by Glenn Schwartz, which he had published in 2021, and he had published research on what appears to be early alphabetic symbols written on small clay cylinders discovered at Tel El Mara in what is known today as Syria. Archaeologists have dated that site and layer to where they found the cylinders to around 2300 BC. This is like well before the time of Abraham, right, if we're just thinking about this, okay? The cylinders may have functioned as tags that provided information about the contents in ceramic jars found at the same site, or their origins or recipients. But again, we await further analysis of the writing they preserve. Some scholars do advise caution in interpreting the evidence at Tel El Mara, and one cautious epigrapher has already carefully referred to this discovery as a potential game changer, since now the history of the alphabet may need to begin around 2300 BC, and in the Levant, not Egypt, you see. Such is the exciting state of this research. But for us, on a very practical note, what this means is that in one form or another, an alphabet was available to Moses and the other writers of the Hebrew Scriptures. Okay? Some often ask, with all the cuneiform, with all the hieroglyphs, how is it anything could have been written with an alphabet by the 13th century BC? How could that happen? Well, the fact is, not only is there an alphabet available by the 13th century BC, but what appears to be ways of learning the alphabet, ways of learning how to write, ways of learning how to copy and how to read. So, which system Moses would have used? Early alphabetic, Ugaritic, or the simplified alphabetic? We can't be certain. What I think we can say definitively is that his life and work would have occurred during the evolution from the linear pictographic to those simplified linear systems. Scribes and writers used this Paleo-Hebrew alphabet until the 4th century BC, and at that time they began using the more familiar to us Aramaic square script for writing and copying. But how did one learn the alphabet and become a scribe? In other words, one question scholars are pushing here is you need more than just an alphabet. You have to have some social mechanisms for learning it and then using it. Does that make sense? And there's not been much evidence for schooling or education or curriculum, you see, up until the last several decades, maybe. So I want to just walk through some of the main lines of evidence for how one learned the ABCs, and then more about what a scribe might do with those ABCs. But the first thing is, our word alphabet comes from the first two letters of the Hebrew and Greek alphabets, aleph, bet, and alpha, beta. Ancient evidence has surfaced, again, from the Levant that shows scribes learned the alphabet by writing it in the form of abecediaries, which were probably scribal school exercises. The word abecediary comes from the order of the letters, or the ABCs. Two orders of that alphabet existed right in the Levant from around 1100 BC. We have this Abgad order, which is even familiar to us, A, B, C, D, okay? And then there's that Halakam order that I mentioned earlier. Those names just come from the first four letters that begin them. The Halakam order is now known from the 15th century BC, as we looked at, and probably came from Egypt, while the Abgad order is first clearly attested in the 11th century BC at Isbet Sarta, which is on the screen right now. And perhaps this Abgad order was known from Egypt, though that's more debated. The relationship between the two, Halakam, Abgad, need not detain us here, but the Abgad order did eventually become the standard order and the one used for the alphabetic writing systems of the Levant. Ancient abecediaries at Kuntillet Rud, this 9th century BC fortress in the central Sinai, probably show two hands. Come back to that here in a second. But here we actually have a good drawing. The line in the stone goes across this way, and it's simply the Hebrew alphabet, familiar to most of you if you know Hebrew, except that Chet and Zion are transposed, as well as the Pei and the Ayin here, okay, in the order. But otherwise, these are the letters of the Hebrew alphabet as represented around 1100 BC. Okay, pretty amazing. And yeah, it would not surprise me if this is how the biblical books looked at one time. But scribal culture, a couple centuries later, at a place known as Kuntillet Rud, we're just wiser now by saying that name, aren't we, Peter? Kuntillet Rud. I wish I should have put a map up here, but basically it's on the border between the Sinai Peninsula and Israel, okay, down in the south here. So probably the main point here is Kuntillet Rud is not that close to Jerusalem, okay? It's a military outpost. It's actually much closer to Egypt than it is Jerusalem. I find that very interesting because there's lots of evidence of writing and learning how to write on this jar here. I'll walk us through the pieces here in a moment. But what's fascinating is this is not something being done by the elite in Jerusalem in the 9th century BC, okay? Because it is a military base or fort of some kind, there's maybe a strong reason to believe that soldiers, or at least some in the army, were learning how to write. This is a little, from this image, it's too faint, but there actually is evidence of an abecediary up here. And then we can actually see that there's a strong abecediary here, the first several letters of the Hebrew alphabet being represented. And we can actually see it down here as well, though it's been scratched out a little bit. And then what's interesting, I don't know if you can see it, but the ink on this clay jar is mostly red, except there's a black line here of black ink. And the best view of this is from William Schniedewind, who argues, or at least suggests, that these in the red ink represent the master scribe, while the abecediary in the black, which is definitely from a less refined hand, maybe suggests the work of an apprentice scribe, learning how to write, you see. So, in other words, just like you learned the alphabet, someone wrote it on a board for you, right? And then either you went to that board and wrote it underneath, or you wrote it from your own desk, yeah? Is that how we all learned how to write? Pretty much, yeah. The method's not going to change, right, in about 2,900 years, right? Yeah, pretty amazing. So, so we probably have teacher and apprentice writing here on this one jar. Greek abecediaries have also been found at several sites of the late Second Temple period, like the Jewish fortress at Masada. These abecediaries were school exercises, showing that some Jews undertook Greek education alongside Hebrew. But that leads us now to another issue about acrostics, which also seem to be scribal exercises in some way. We have several acrostic poems in the Hebrew Bible illustrating the central place of the alphabet in scribal education. We will not look at all of these, but Psalms 9 and 10, Psalm 25, 34, 37, 111, 112. Probably all of you are familiar with Psalm 119 as a massive acrostic psalm. Psalm 145, Proverbs 31, 10 to 31, even Lamentations is structured this way. So this is just the first part of Psalm 145, 1 to 7. And after the superscription to the psalm, you immediately wind up with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet beginning the verse. And then you get, a little bit further down, you get the second letter, Beth, and Gimel, and Daleth, and so on and so forth, all the way through the first 7 verses of Psalm 145. This particular scroll kind of breaks off and then picks up in the next column with the rest. Proverbs 31, 10 to 23, in the Leningrad Codex. Again, this is the poem about the Proverbs 31 woman in verses 10 to 23. And once again, picking up with an acrostic format, each verse beginning with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Notice by the time these acrostics are written, every one of them is Abgad order. There's no evidence of the Halakam order in these acrostic poems. Every last one of them is that stable or standard Abgad order. What's the point of acrostic poems? It does seem that a scribe may want to address a topic kind of from A to Z, so to speak. The acrostic is visually and concretely organized. In Proverbs 31, 10 to 31, the writer structures the poem about the virtuous woman, the concretizing of personified wisdom earlier in the book, right? The father presents wisdom as a beautiful woman to his son early on. And at the very end of the book, woman wisdom now takes concrete form in the excellent or virtuous woman here. So just as wisdom takes the concrete form of an actual wife, so the description of the wife takes the very concrete form of the acrostic. The form matches the content here. The acrostic graphically or visually displays order and completeness in writing, while the content concretizes abstract wisdom in the person of the virtuous woman. In the original, of course, the literary artistry is on full display, but translation necessarily diminishes the literary form. That is, we can't replicate the acrostic in English. As much as I tried to back here, you just can't really get there. So acrostics, definitely used as a tool for learning the alphabet, but also, I think, covering a topic from A to Z, so to speak. Okay, so now what? Early scribal education beyond the ABCs. Someone now knows their olives, baiths, and gimels. What do they do with it next? Well, it looks like that after learning the alphabet, an ancient apprentice scribe would continue in his elementary education by learning to write and memorize vocabulary lists all the way to learning the literature of his curriculum. if you've taken elementary Hebrew with Dr. Bass, then this is starting to sound very familiar, because once you learn your aleph, beiths, and gimels, then you're learning what? A lot of vocabulary lists, aren't you? Yeah. I know. Dr. Gurry, you're not off the hook either. That's how Greek works too, right? So, that's right. Got to learn the vocabulary. So, otherwise, one cannot read and one cannot write in the language that they are learning. So, regarding lists, and I think we can all resonate with this, but one old Babylonian text puts it this way, quote, "If you have learned the scribal art, you had recited all of it, the different lines, chosen from the scribal art, the names of the animals living in the steppe, to the names of artisans you have written, but after that you hate writing." End quote. So after you are done listing out everything, you now hate writing. I think that's right. Here we see the dynamic, though, between writing and reciting or memorizing names of animals and professions. Many Hebrew inscriptions from ancient Israel, as well as biblical texts, reveal the same practice of listing the names of people. So I tend to think of this list of Solomon's administrators in 1 Kings 4, 1-19. You've got Solomon's chiefs kind of listed out first here, and then you've got all of his officers listed here as well. Some you might think of the list of David's warriors in 2 Samuel 23, 8-12, or the list of place names in that Levitical city list in Joshua chapter 21, or just lists of things like the king's provisions in 1 Kings 4, 22-23, or one that's very interesting is here's Ecclesiastes 3. And how many of us know there is a time for everything under the heavens? Yeah, we know this. And what's interesting, right, is the list form is kept. A time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to uproot what has been planted. And that list kind of continues all the way through. It's probably the case that the manuscript here, even though it's dated to 1000 AD, probably reflects closely the original list of the times, you see. So, I mean, breaking rank with how the scribe was sort of just copying out Ecclesiastes, and then he hits chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, and then all of a sudden the form changes and simply starts to look like an old scribal list. Again, in the context of scribal exercises, the clay jar of Kentillet Ajrud may show early evidence of the scribe learning to list items and distinguish letter sounds in different words. At this time, there was no way to distinguish the sound of S and Sh in Hebrew. The first word the scribe would know as Samaria or Shomron. But the sheen in the final word could indicate Sha'arim, gates, or So'arim, barley. And so here is the problem in the second word, whether we're talking about Sha'arim, gates, or Sa'arim, barley. And again, because there's no way to distinguish this. Eventually, this letter can be distinguished in sound once a little dot is added to it, and then it would make an S, a S, or a Sh sound. But we're not there yet in the history of Hebrew writing. Shomron, and these two choices would be arranged based on the shape of the letter, not its sound. Thus, in the context of education, the lesson for the apprentice scribe is probably that of polysemy, or multiple meanings, or the fact that one grapheme, one letter, was capable of two different sounds depending on the context. Looking at a drawing of this Kentillet Ajrud, then again, we now see, we see a list of 5 or 6 personal names all the way out here. So this was the part of the jar we were looking at earlier. Here's the ABCDaries. And then over here now, we have, again, a scribe practicing listing out proper names, which is kind of interesting. And it actually ends with Mitzri, or an Egyptian. Again, because Kintiladaj root is close to Egypt, it seems. The sixth term is probably to be rendered in Egyptian, further underscoring that this is a practice text, and also that Kintiladaj root was ruled by Egypt during the late Bronze Age and reclaimed by Pharaoh Shishak in the 10th century BC. The term was relevant for the local apprentice scribe to learn, since Kintiladaj root was close to Egypt. Thus, the 9th century Hebrew scribe must also learn the skill of recording names in lists as part of the elementary scribal curriculum. We also again glimpse an apprentice scribe in the biblical text at Judges 8:14. Maybe you're familiar with this verse. And Gideon captured a young man at Succoth and questioned him. And the young man wrote down for him the officials and elders of Succoth, 77 men. The Hebrew term na'ar, translated as young man here in this verse, probably is better understood to be not any young man, but a scribal apprentice who had the skill to create the list of officials and elders at Succoth. In 1 Kings 4:33, the narrator presents Solomon in the mold of an ancient scribe or scholar as he discoursed, quote, about trees, from the cedar which is in Lebanon to the hyssop which grows in the wall. And he spoke about beasts, birds, reptiles, and fish. Solomon had cataloged the trees from great to small and the animals according to their kinds, and could recite them as the scribes of the ancient Near East did. From mastering the alphabet, vocabulary, and lists, the student would learn the common formulae contained in letters, treatises, and legal contracts, before learning proverbial sayings and more advanced writing. And we have time just to look at the letter writing here, and then we'll be wrapping this up. So letter writing was prominent throughout the ancient Near East, and of course letters appear in the Bible, right, in great number. Letter writing arose from the oral context of sending messengers who had memorized the message from the sender and then would perform it for the addressee. We saw this earlier with the Sumerian etiology at Enmakar and the Lord of Aratta. When the message became too long and complicated for the messenger to memorize, King Enmakar takes out clay and inscribes the message on it, and then sends it with the messenger so that the communication would be accurate. In the Bible, we see the oral context in the Jacob and Esau correspondence in Genesis 32, verses 4 to 14, with Jacob sending messengers with a message, who deliver that message to Esau and then return a message to Jacob from Esau. These same oral conventions, right, of a person says to another person, right, were eventually fixed in the written letter form. In 2 Kings 5:5-7, we read that the king of Syria sends a letter to the king of Israel requesting that Naaman come to him and be cured of his leprosy. One king sends a letter and the other reads it. Many more examples, like in 2 Samuel 11, when David's plot is written on a letter to take out Uriah. That plot is written on a letter and given to Joab. Letter writing, therefore, to become a crucial part of the scribal curriculum. If you were learning to write, you had to be able to write a letter. And we can now manifestly see it at Kintiladaj root in the context of the apprentice scribes' exercises. In particular, scribes needed to practice the standard introductory formulas. In this particular example, the full intro letter formula is on display. There's an address, a greeting, and a blessing. What's more is that this part of the clay shows scraping or erasing, further underscoring the apprentice scribes were practicing this letter form to get it right. What's interesting about the opening 3 lines is the repetition of the Hebrew word amar, to say. Even the name Amaryo is probably not a real person here, but further underscores the play on the root for message and saying, to further reinforce the purpose of conveying in writing what the sender says. So, yeah, you've got Amar, Amar, and Amar here 3 times, you see. So again, just further emphasizing for the student what this is about. The name Amaro is probably not a real person, but again underscoring the root for the word to say. The early letter form has clear parallels in the Bible. For example, in 2 Kings 22:15, the prophetess Huldah couches her words in the letter format. And Huldah said to them, "Thus says Amar, Yahweh, the God of Israel." And then Amar 2, say to the man who sent you to me. Both the speaker or sender and the addressee are identified by the repetition of the verb amar, to say, in both the practice text and the biblical text. Before we move on from here, we need to see the connection between the letter formulas and the prophetic introductory phrase, "Thus says the Lord." Again, Bill Schniedewind says this, quote, "The phrase has its specific origins in the letter genre that begins, 'A person says,' which is often translated a message of the sender. The formula, 'Thus says Yahweh,' or 'Thus says the Lord,' is thus directly related to the ancient messenger form. Moreover, this textualization of the writing prophets should likewise be associated with the textualization of the Near Eastern messenger scene. So not only does study of ancient scribal culture tell us how the Bible was written and copied, but it also informs us about its literary forms, right, that we're reading, especially the prophets as messengers, as in this example. Furthermore, it also shows that the prophets were ministering at a peak time of scribal activity, the flowering of centuries of development of messengers being sent and letters being written, and now these prophets being sent by Yahweh himself and prefacing every one of those letters or speeches or messages with "Thus says Yahweh." Okay, I'm going to skip the little part on proverbial saying, and though there does seem to be some limited evidence of this. But what about advanced scribal curriculum? There's very little known about this, frankly, especially in Israel, because what may have looked like fuller compositions on the walls at Kintillet Ajrut are very difficult to read. These frescoes are impossible to read, actually. So we don't have much remaining if there were longer compositions found or there at one time. We don't know. But what seems to be clear, logically at least, is that the elementary scribe would begin to transition to more advanced curriculum in the writing, memorizing, and adapting of proverbial sayings and messages and these sorts of things. And after mastering all of this, an apprentice would finally undergo advanced education. In Mesopotamia, an advanced student would memorize and recite the canonical compositions such as the Epic of Gilgamesh. The epilogue to the Babylonian creation epic, known as the Enuma Elish, Mario mentioned this last night, actually gives us maybe a glimpse of what this advanced curriculum might look like. It says that the wise and knowledgeable should ponder them, that is what was just said, together. The master should repeat and make the pupil understand. The revelation which the first one discoursed before him, that is Marduk, he wrote down, that is the chief scribe, he wrote down and preserved for the future to hear. The first one, the master scribe, wrote down the epic for future generations to hear. And the master scribes had their students understand it or recite it by heart. This text suggests that the advanced student does not copy the text as much as memorize what the master repeats. Assuming West Semites adapted the advanced education of the Mesopotamian scribal curriculum, alphabetic scribes would have been busy writing, memorizing, and adapting their own alphabetic texts. Thus, we may be able to contextualize how scribes eventually augmented the ending of Deuteronomy with the narrative about Moses' death, for example. So I don't think Moses wrote about his own death, right, in Deuteronomy 34. But clearly, someone who knew that would be able to add it. And we may be able to see also how certain scribes updated some of the place names, such as Genesis 14:14's reference to Dan, which Judges 18:29 tells us was originally called Laish. Thus, we can see that the scribe in Genesis 14:14 wanted to ensure that his later audience understood, right, in which direction Abram chased after Lot. All right, I'm going to skip this as well. What did they write with? I want to say one last thing about who the ancient scribe was, and then I'll be done. So, who was the ancient scribe? Unfortunately, right, almost all, if not all, are anonymous, okay? And yet, the ancient world is brimming with scribes and scribal activity. But how did they evaluate their own profession, especially in contrast to other trades? And some of these are quite interesting. Here's a quote from Egypt, okay? So this is about the scribal profession in Egypt. It says this: "I have seen the smith at work at the opening of his furnace, with fingers like the claws of a crocodile. He stinks more than fish roe. The jewel maker bores with his chisel and hard stone of all kinds. When he's finished the inlay of the eye, his arms are spent. He's weary. The potter is under the soil, though as yet among the living. He grubs in the mud more than a pig in order to fire his pots. The farmer wails more than the guinea fowl. His voice is louder than a raven's. His fingers are swollen and stink to excess." So this is how some of the trades are described. Now, interesting. What about this? After denigrating these trades, this text continues and says, "There's no profession without a boss, except for a scribe." Isn't that funny? Because you all want that, right? You want the profession without a boss. Yeah? Yeah. And so he's basically saying that all those other trades, right, have these serious drawbacks, but there's no profession without a boss except for a scribe. He is the boss. Hence, if you know writing, it will do better for you than those professions I've set before you, each more wretched than the other. The day in school will profit you. Its works are forever. Yeah, that's right. Here's one more, also taken from Egypt. "Do you not recall the condition of the cultivator faced with the registration of the harvest tax after the worm has carried off half of the corn and the hippopotamus has eaten up the rest? The mice abound in the field, the locust descends, the cattle devour. The sparrows bring want upon the cultivator. The remainder that is on the threshing platform is almost at an end and is for the thieves. But a scribe, he is at the head of everybody's work." So, of course, there's probably some hyperbole in these descriptions, but it seems pretty clear that these societies considered the scribal profession to be difficult, but one that led to prestige and wealth. Well, I'm at time, so I'm going to just close with a few conclusions here, if I can find it. Yeah, here we go. Just a big so what here on ancient scribal activity. The biggest one is, without these scribes, there is no Bible. Okay, that's the biggest one. There are centuries of copying the biblical text that we cannot account for. All we have are these little windows into their activities, okay? None of them are named. There are no scribes in Israel, Egypt, Mesopotamia that are named. In fact, it's usually the king's name that goes on all the documents. But all of this history is fascinating in its own right, and indeed many scholars from all backgrounds and commitments have engaged in it. But here as Christians, I want us to think through this, and particularly about how we got our Bible. We learn that the earliest scribes received, adapted, and transmitted the Near Eastern scribal curriculum for their national, religious, and military purposes in Israel. This means that scribes worked with a double tendency with regard to texts. They worked both to conserve texts and also to update or innovate scribal methods. We know that they conserved many aspects of the curriculum, but also innovated it some. Though we can't know for sure what the biblical text looked like from this period, we do know scribes copied their text conservatively and yet also freely. And these same characteristics manifest themselves in the later period of the text transmission. Second, what we learn What we learn chiefly from this early period is that God was orchestrating things providentially so that an alphabet and alphabetic scribal culture would exist by the time Moses and the prophets put stylus or reed pen to a writing surface. Not only scribal culture, but the scribal curriculum was already well and long advanced to the point of not only writing abecediaries, but also lists, letters, proverbs, and literature. As Yahweh revealed himself to the prophets as his messengers, the function of messenger and the literary form of the letter were already available for prophets to adapt for Yahweh's good purposes, as he not only revealed his judgments to come on Israel, but also the future consolation and salvation to be proclaimed throughout the world. All of this could be, and indeed was, written down to show that Yahweh is indeed the faithful and only God, the one who knows the end from the beginning. Finally, just last point here. Some years ago, I was speaking to churches in Salt Lake City, Utah, kind of a bastion of Mormonism, if you know this in the States. And after the conference, I and the pastors went downtown to the Mormon Temple Square, and we took the tour that they provided. And it was like definitely a sense of spiritual warfare going on as I'm walking downtown through what they call the Temple Square. And at one point, the tour guides were asked about where the Book of Mormon came from. I didn't ask the question. I thought about it, but I didn't ask. We were told not to be antagonized, so I didn't. But someone else, not in our group, asked where the Book of Mormon came from. And the tour guides put it this way. They said, well, many don't believe it, but we believe Joseph Smith translated hieroglyphs off golden plates into English. And that's how we got our book. Many don't believe it, but we do. And I've thought about this for a bit now. Many Christians probably have accepted the Bible as God's word on a similar notion, right? And that's really fine as far as it goes. Some of you just maybe came here and didn't realize, wow, I didn't know there's so much history to this, okay? But there's a significant difference in the fact that if we are questioned, or if we were questioned about where the Bible came from, we could point people to the evidence and the facts of history. That is, the Bible has a human history that we can show people and point people to. Its authenticity has never been subject to a vision. The Bible's authenticity has never been subject to a vision. In our culture, as deconstruction of authority and ancient authorities in particular continues, Christians need to be able to articulate what is different about the Bible's history and move to the Bible's divine authority. Thank you very much.